بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Continuing the موضوع important topics in quality. This session will address a very important topic in the context of health professional education. I'll talk about the enterprise risk management and its implication on health professional education in general. So by the end of this session, I expect you will be able to define those key concepts related to the risk management, and you compare the different management framework, and of course, you'll be able to analyze the impact of compliance, hazards control, opportunity risk, which is a very important concept that we will discuss today, inshallah, and to identify the various risk mitigation strategy. It's not all about identifying the risk, it's about what we can do about them. And then you'll be able, hopefully, inshallah, to explain the principles of enterprise risk management and its integration in the overall institutional process. My talk will have 4 sections. Within each section, there are several parts that address different titles within that section. So I'll start by the first section, which is an introduction to the risk management in general, not precisely the enterprise risk management. I will start by the risk management itself, starting by the approaches to risk management. And to talk about that, perhaps we would like to start by giving some of the important definitions. Regarding the definition of risk itself, the ISO guide number 73 provides a comprehensive definition of risk, which describe the risk as the effect of uncertainty on object. So this definition highlights, as you know, the risk that can both be positive and negative. And during the this recording, I will highlight how is that possible, the risk to be a positive risk or a negative risk, and perhaps when we shed the light on the what we call the opportunity risk, that will give a good example on that. Now, also the Institute of Risk Management, the IRM, described the risk as the combination of the probability of an event happening and the consequence of the event. Definitely, there are other definitions. These definitions include that the risk by the Oxford Dictionary defines it as the chance and the possibility of danger, the loss, the injury, and other adverse consequences, generally speaking. Also, the Institution of Internal Audit, the IIA, defines risk in terms of a consequence and likelihood of one, which reflects the more analytical approach of the term risk. So that's very important to start with, which is to define the risk itself. Now let's go over the 4 main types of risk that the organization might face. So we have first what we call the compliance risk. And the compliance risks are related to legal, regulatory standards and standards for compliance. Now, in healthcare itself, for example, these risks involve ensuring that the healthcare providers follow all the necessary regulatory guidelines and accreditation standards. Now, failing to do so could result in some sort of penalties or legal issues related to those standards, even the loss of certification. Now, in the educational setting, the compliance risk might involve ensuring that the institution meets the accreditation requirements or that the courses adheres to the required competencies. Now, this is what's related to the definition of the compliance risk. Now, next to that is what we call the hazard risk. Now, these risks means they can only have a negative outcomes. That's why we call them hazard risk. And there's also a definition hazard itself, and perhaps we go into to dig deep into that in some of our next session. However, when we say hazard risk, that means a risk that can only have a negative outcome. Now, think about the natural disaster, for example, like earthquake, floods, even the pandemic events. So that have no upside and can cause significant disruption in the healthcare education or the healthcare provision in general. Now, in healthcare, precisely the hazard risks might include things like fire in a hospital or a system failure that affect the patient care. Similarly, if you look at that dimension into the educational context, that's the hazard risk could include accidents or emergencies that put the students or the staff risk during the clinical placement or on-campus activities. And I think the current ongoing armed conflict situation in Sudan will be a good example of the hazard risks that can affect the healthcare profession institution. Now, moving on, we have what we call also the control risk. Now, these arise from the uncertainty in how tasks or projects are executed. So, for instance, in healthcare and a control risk could involve uncertainty in clinical procedures, errors in patient medications, improper handling of the patient data in technologies or curriculum in educational setting that include the poor implementation of technologies or curriculum changes. Now, the control risks often come from a lack of oversight or ineffective process, and that's why we addressed in the last week through two webinars the importance of having a quality framework and using the proper quality management tools related to the processes of an institution to make sure that we have the most efficient process in place to avoid or mitigate those risks. And finally, we have what we call the opportunity risk. In the previous slide or in the slide of the objectives, I mentioned that there is sometimes there is aspects not all negative related to risk. So unlike other types, opportunity risk are associated with taking a risk to achieve a positive outcome. So in healthcare, for example, this might involve investing in a new technology, expanding the service, while these ventures have the potential for great rewards, they also carry the risk of failure. If you take the same dimension and apply it to the educational context, an example of that comes with risk like failure to attract enough students or securing even resources to the student themselves. So again, those are the main four types of risks. So let's now look at how we describe risk. We need to know first what we call the risk event. So we have the risk event, which are specific situations or occurrences that can impact the organization objectives. So think here of them as identifiable moments of events such as a system failure or data breach in the university or regulatory change that could disrupt the operations of the institution. Next to that, we have the concept of risk sources. Now, this refers to where the risk originates. It could be external or like the market fluctuation or even regulatory changes in the country, or internal such as issues with operational processes or system failure. Why we're talking about that? Because it's very important to understand the source of the risk itself, because it's crucial for determining how to manage the risk itself. Then we have what we call the consequence in the risk context. The consequence is the impact. It's the impact that the risk event could have. It actually occurs. For example, a risk event like a data breach could have a significant financial and reputational consequences for the organization. And the last one, we could consider the likelihood. The term likelihood is very important. And this refers to the probability of the risk event happening. Now, for each risk, we assess whether it's likely to occur and how often it will occur, which help us to uh, prioritize which risk exactly we need to put our focus attention on it. Now, here I will explain a very important term which we call the inherent level risk. Now, first, let's define what it is exactly. Now, the inherent risk refers to the level of risk that exists in the absence of any controls or mitigation strategy. Now, it is the raw or untreated risk. So it's the risk itself without applying any mitigation strategy to that risk, and that was what we start with actually before applying any safety measures or processes or procedures to reduce it. The key considerations here is that it helps us to identify the untreated or raw level of risk. Why is that? Because this is important because it serves as a baseline for assessing how effective our risk controls are. Now, if we don't know the inherent risk, it will be hard to us to measure how much we will reduce that risk throughout the intervention that will be held by the university or the faculty. And finally, we have what we call the impact of understanding the inherent level of risk. Is that it gives us an insight into the importance of the treatment efforts. It also shows us how much efforts we need to put into mitigating the risk, which areas may require the most attention. Okay, risk classification system. So we have what we call in the risk classification system, we have what we call the firm score card, which focuses on the 4 key areas of risk: financial, infrastructure, reputational, and marketplace risk. Now, this system is commonly used in industries that need to evaluate their risk across these dimensions, helping the organization to manage both the tangible and intangible aspects of their operations. There's also what we call the PESTEL, which is a broader framework that classifies the risk according to the political component, economic component, social component, technological, and legal and environmental factors. And that's where PESTEL work come from. So the PESTEL is useful for organizations operating in dynamic environments where the external factors like the regulation, the market trends can significantly impact the operation. So let's have an example for that. For example, any changes in the legislations or the economic downturns can pose considerable risk that must be managed proactively. And after that, we have the risk register. This is a very important component, and I will talk about it in details in the in few minutes. Now, it's a tool used to document and classify risk based on um, whichever classification system is selected. Why is that? Why it's useful? Because it helps us as an organization to keep track of the identified risk, their potential impact, and the controls in place to mitigate them. Remember, mitigation strategies, the concept of risk management, identifying risk is not the essence. The essence is what we can do about them. And that's why it's very important to talk about how we can mitigate them. And it's essential tool, of course, for ongoing risk management to ensure that all the identified risks are continuously monitored, updated as necessary. Now, there is very important terms we need to discuss here is that how risk can be classified using tools like uh, not tools actually, some terms that help us to identify those risks, regardless the tools that being used. And that's why it's very important to talk about two important terms, which are the likelihood and the magnitude of risk. Uh, uh, the risk likelihood tell us how probable a risk event is, whether it's something that we expect to happen frequently, occasionally, or rarely. Let's have an example on that. So in the healthcare sector, the likelihood of facing compliance issues might be high if there's a constant change in the regulation or accreditation standards. Now, likelihood alone is not enough. You know, we also need to consider what we call the risk magnitude, how severe the consequences would be if the risk materializes. Now, while some risks might happen frequently, their impact could be low. And on the other hand, a rare event could have catastrophic consequences. Now, like a major data breach, which will affect thousands of patient records. So both likelihood and the magnitude need to be evaluated together for a very comprehensive risk management point of view. So that's where the risk matrix comes, and it combines these two factors, the likelihood and the magnitude, to help to prioritize the risk. Which risk exactly for us as an institution are important. Now, by plotting those risks onto the matrix, I'm going to show you a picture of how it looks exactly. We can see which ones pose the most significant threat and require immediate attention versus those that can be monitored or even treated over time. Now, coming to the term or the focus of this particular session, which is the enterprise risk management. Um, the enterprise risk management, or the ERM, it's an approach that integrates risk management into the every level and process within the organization. So, regardless the type of the organization, whether it's a healthcare facility, whether it's a medical school, or otherwise. Now, it's healthcare or education, for example. It helps us to address risks that spans to multiple areas, such as staff shortage, clinical errors, study placement, compliance with regulation, and etc. Now, it's very important always when it comes to the risk to adopt a holistic approach. That's why we're talking now about the enterprise risk management rather than having a precise components or a precise type of risk and talk about it. For a medical school, for example, a school might adopt an enterprise risk management to manage risk associated with student safety during clinical rotations. At the same time, they'll need to ensure that they remain compliant with the accreditation standards. So the ERM here allows us to balance between the concerns of integrating risk management to the academic and the operational practice at the same time. Now, risk management can be implemented in varying levels of sophistication, depending on organizations' need and available resources. So, having this flexibility in adoption make it useful to be adopted and implemented, whether you work in a low resource setting or otherwise. Um, yes. So, for instance, in the context of health professional education, the level of risk management may vary, as I mentioned a moment. At a basic level, this could involve a simple incident reporting system for student safety during the clinical placement. However, at more advanced level, the institution may implement a fully integrated ERM strategies that address risk across the clinical training, accreditation, operational functions, and even the student and the staff well-being. So whether the organization is just starting with the hazard identification or managing risk through a full-scale ERM system, the sophistication level basically of risk management depends on the complexity of the risk they face. And I always say you don't need to start in an advanced approach for enterprise risk management, but you can start with very simple tools. You'll be surprised about having the system is very much important and effective than focusing your effort on investing on technology and advanced ERM system and implement it then within your organization. Now, going to the second part, which is the impact of risk on organization. So the level of risk here, we need to talk here about the level of risk, which refers to the overall risk profile. The term profile perhaps we'll have the chance also to talk about this in the future. It's very important to know exactly how it looks and what is the uses of the risk profile and etc. But coming to the definition of the level of risk, it refers to the overall risk profile, which is determined by the combination of risk likelihood and risk magnitude, two concepts that we previously discussed when looking at the risk matrix. Now, essentially, this tells us how serious a risk is based on both how likely it is to happen and how severe the consequences would be. Now, when we conduct a risk assessment, we consider both the inherent risk, which is the level of risk without applying any controls in place or mitigation, and the residual risk. The residual risk, we mean by that what remains after we implement a risk control. Now, this helps us to see how effective our risk management efforts are. Another important concept here we need to address is what we call the risk tolerance. The risk tolerance. Now, this refers to the level of risk that an organization is willing to accept in pursuit of its objective. There's huge publications and things in the literature related to the concept of risk tolerance. I invite you to look into that. Very interesting topic. You cannot, stop reading an article after an article related to the risk tolerance. Very interesting. Different organizations actually have different levels of risk tolerance depending on their industry, resources, goals. For example, some industries like construction, let's say, might have the highest risk tolerance due to the nature of their work compared to the lower risk context such as service industries. I mean, construction versus service. هنلقى إنه موضوع الريسك tolerance differs between both of these. Now, let's focus on a specific type of hazard, specific type of risk, what we call the hazard risk. Perhaps I will talk a little bit here more because it's absolutely related to what's going on in our beloved country these days. The hazard risk and the impact can have on organization is diverse. Hazard risks are those that typically result in negative outcome, such as natural disasters, accidents, man-made hazards, equipment failures, and the list goes on and on and on. There are some risk assessment tools that have a ready list for those hazards. Now, these risks can have a far-reaching effect on the organization's operations, finances, and even the reputation itself. So that's why we need to look at some of the key impact. If we look to the financial impact, the risk often lead to direct financial losses, such as the cost of repairs or fines from regulatory bodies. For example, if a natural disaster damages a facility, the organization faces significant repair costs. And same applies to the current war going in Sudan. There will be significant costs for repairing. When it comes to the reputational impact, when these risks materializes, they can damage organizations' credibility and the trust of the stakeholder placed in it, in this institution. For instance, if equipment failures lead to service disruption, it might harm the organization reputation. The operational impact from a standing point, a hazard risk disrupt the daily processes. So, for example, a power failure or a system crash can halt operation, affecting the productivity and the service delivery. Now, attachment risk. What does that mean? Attachment risk refers to how we can categorize and connect risk to the different elements within the organization. This is important because it helps us to better understand where risks originate and how they can be managed. Now, if we look to the key attributes to which risk can be attached, it can be the assets, where risk can be linked to both the physical asset or like the buildings or the equipments or the intellectual properties, such as the patents or the proprietary technologies, or the processes themselves, where the risk can arise in processes, such as manufacturing, service delivery, or any other operational procedures. Here, the process failure, for example, can lead to significant disruption. And we have the people key aspects or attributes, where the risk can also be attached to employees or other stakeholders. For example, a lack for training staff or a staff shortage can present serious risk to the organization operations and the reputation as well. Now, the basic concept here for risk and reward is that a higher potential reward often come with higher risk. The organization need to assess whether pursuing the risk is worth the potential gain, which we call risk balancing. Now, one of the most common types that we see here is what we call the opportunity risk. Now, these are risks that organization deliberately take in order to pursue business growth. For example, This could involve making a new investment or entering a new market. We had in Saturday group work exercise in the institutional strategic planning presentation by one of the groups, Group One, that the growth component is one of the important areas in the strategic plan. And here I'm linking this to the concept of risk and how risk itself or the opportunity risk can play a role in that. For example, this could involve making a new investment or entering a new market, as I mentioned, and the potential rewards might be substantial, but the risk involved could be equally significant. Now, this brings us to the idea of what we call risk-reward balance, as I mentioned in a few minutes before. Here, the organization must carefully assess the opportunity to explain, to assess the whether the potential reward outline the risk they are taking. So basically, the opportunity to expand into a new market might seem appealing, right? But the risk of regulatory challenges or market volatility needs to be considered at the same time. A practical example of this is investing in the technology itself. While if you think about it, adopting new technology might yield higher returns or improve the efficiency, like what we're doing in the concept of e-learning. But it also comes with risk failure, implementation challenges, or even technical difficulties that needs to be considered at the same time. So attitude to risk, organization and individual typically fall into one of three categories when it comes to the risk. Risk aversion. So some organizations here prefer to avoid risk altogether, right? Even if it means settling for lower return. But they prioritize safety because they prioritize safety and stability over potential gains, which can be a common approach in industries where compliance and safety are crucial, right? And a healthcare provision is the one good example for that. The other dimension or attitude here is the risk neutrality. Now, others take more balanced approach, meaning what? That means to evaluate the risk logically and don't lean toward either avoiding or taking risk. So their decision actually based purely on the fact of risk at hand without inherent bias or otherwise. And a very important term, we call it the risk appetite. Here, on the other hand, of this particular spectrum, some organizations are more willing to accept higher levels of risk in pursuit of a greater reward. For example, technology startups may have a higher risk appetite pursuing for innovation and market growth despite the uncertainty involved. So it's here. It's very important to note that the organizational factors such as the culture, the industry, the strategic goals play a significant role in shaping this attitude, and constructing company will likely have a different risk appetite than the financial institution, and the attitudes often even changing the market condition. Okay. So how risks are triggered? Now, knowing the risk is one area, but how they are triggered. So the event or condition that can initiate the occurrence of a risk, right? The trigger is essentially something that sets a risk event in motion, right? Identifying this trigger is very important and critical Why is that? Because it helps the organization to recognize risk early and allowing them to take preventive measures. There's a term that we're using in emergency and disaster medicine. We call it the early warning system, the early warning approach. Now, there are two main types of triggers. There's the internal triggers, which are events that originate from within the organization, such as the system failure or human errors. For example, a key system malfunction, or even during critical operations, could trigger operational risk. And there is the external triggers. These comes from the outside of the organization, such as changes in the regulations and market fluctuations, or even natural disasters. So a sudden change in the political landscape, for instance, might trigger also regulatory risk for business and operation in general. The importance of identifying triggers cannot be overstated because by recognizing these potential events, organizations can better prepare for risk, enabling early detection and more effective management strategies. A good example for that, imagine a scenario where new regulations are suddenly introduced in the market. If an institution is aware that the regulatory changes are a frequent trigger, they can have a contingency plans in place to adapt quickly. And the result of that will be to minimize those risks. Now I'll go to the third part of the first section, which about the types of risk. It's important to consider the different aspects in this regard. The most important one is the time scale of risk impact, which is the time frame over the which the risk could affect an organization. So we categorize risk into short term, medium term, and long term based on how quickly they may materialize and their potential impact. So the short-term risks are the risks that could immediately affect the operations of the program or the institution. If we take an example in health professional education, this might involve sudden faculty absenteeism or technological failure, the disruption of online classes. All these require rapid response to minimize the disruption. And this is a good example of short-term risk. I would like to relate that to some of our area in the emergency disaster medicine. We see this a lot during emerging diseases, outbreaks, or epidemic, where you see huge absenteeism in the healthcare professionals or even other industries. Now, the medium-term risks, which are typically emerge over a semester or academic year, for instance, a change in accreditation requirements or declining students' enrollment might evolve gradually, but still need to be addressed within the academic cycle to prevent any long-term consequences of this issue. The long-term risk is actually risk that evolve over years. Sorry, and might involve significant changes in the healthcare education standards or advancement in technology. And of course, they require to complete, and that required, of course, a complete curriculum overhaul. So managing these risks involving is strategic, forward-thinking planning. Now, if you consider the COVID-19 pandemic, which led to the rapid implementation of the online learning, this posed both short-term risks, such as the technological issues with delivering the online classes, and the long-term risk like the needing to adjust the curricula to the newly educational norm. That's why it's very important to address these requirements within the context of enterprise risk management. So We need to go deep into the four main types of risks that organization come on the face, especially in the context of health profession education. I addressed before what we call the compliance risk, the hazard risk, the control risk, and the opportunity risk. So again, it's very important to take these four types all together with you as we go, because that's a good starting point when we learn about the enterprise risk management. Now, I will talk more here about the opportunity risk. I talked previously about the hazard risk. However, here I would like to emphasize on the opportunity risk. Now, the concept behind the opportunity risk is that in health profession education, institutions often take risks when they develop a new teaching method or even expand into a new regions. Now, for example, launching a new distance learning program or adopting an innovative technology carries both a potentiality for significant rewards and a risk of failure itself. So this is where risk appetite comes into place, where institutions need to decide how much risk they are willing to take, and that's takes me to the balancing of risk approach I talked about previously. Uncertainty risk also arise from unpredictable factors like student performance, clinical outcomes, or even change in regulation, as I mentioned in a few minutes before. Now, these risks are more difficult to anticipate, but organization can still take steps to manage them effectively. Um, The approach for that will be through risk assessment, which involves regularly assessing risk, such as the fluctuating student success rates, evolving healthcare regulations, and we need to keep a close eye on these areas. Institutions can catch problems early and take corrective actions. And we'll talk in the previous in the next section about the controlling measure of those risks. Now, scenario planning is very important. So preparing for possible changes in clinical education due to unforeseen healthcare development like the pandemic is essential. For instance, scenarios planning allows institutions to be ready for sudden shifts to teaching formats or healthcare protocols. I talked in the SHEDCON, Sudan Health Professional Education Conference, about some of the techniques of hazard vulnerability analysis and risk assessment that help us to manage such issues related to the uncertainty risk. Now, the flexibility is key. Now, organization here must be able to adapt quickly to changes in the educational delivery, such as switching from in-person to online education, similar to what happened during the pandemic, and also as what's going on now in Sudan. So an example for that, the shift from additional OSCE to virtual assessment during the pandemic introduced a lot of uncertainty regarding how student performance would be evaluated. An institution had to quickly implement a scenario planning and flexible strategies to adapt to this new environment. And that's why, again, in SharePoint 2023, we discussed this particular example, the OSCE, and the student performance in OSCE, the setup, the structure, and 13 points, which is available now in Professor Sahel channel or the program channel. I will invite you to go and look for further details related to this point I just mentioned in a moment. Okay, so yeah. Now, This is one of the important areas that I usually spend a lot of time talking about this, because the whole essence, remember, the whole essence not about risk management is not to identify the risk itself. The risk itself to be identified is a very important component. However, you need to have the tools that support you to apply some of the mitigation strategies to overcome those risks and to mitigate hazard risk precisely in health profession education. Here, we might look into mitigation strategy that involve physical, psychological harm to students, and even during the even the staff during uh, 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 during those hazard risk if they occur, God forbid. Now, the hazard risks are particularly concerning because, as I mentioned, they directly affect the students' safety, especially the environment like the hospital, where exposure of infectious diseases or clinical incident is something that can happen on daily basis. Now, we can mitigate these risks through several methods. The general classification of mitigation strategy is basically classified into structural or non-structural mitigation strategy. But there are methods within those. Those methods include the preventive measures, which one of the most effective ways to reduce hazard by providing a strict infection control training to the students before they join or begin their clinical rotation, and also uh, which prepares them to minimize their exposure to safety problems. Insurance is another critical step of ensuring that the students and faculty have adequate liability insurance that's provide, of course, safety net in case something does go wrong in the clinical environment. That's why one of the pre-registration requirements of the healthcare profession here in Saudi Arabia is to have what we call malpractice insurance. Malpractice insurance. Preparedness plan, I always say investing in preparedness is a good call for the institution. So having protocols in place for emergencies such as disease outbreaks or clinical accidents ensure that the students and the faculty know how to respond to mitigate those impacts of such event. An example of that, again, during COVID-19 pandemic, many health education many health education institutions implemented enhanced safety measures such as the PPE training to reduce the hazard risk of students being exposed to the virus during their hospital placement. Now, the compliance risk refers to the danger of failing to meet the accreditation standards, which can result in penalties or even worst cases, the loss of the program approval from the accrediting body. Now, to minimize the compliance risk, we can adopt a multifaceted approach. First, we can implement regular audits where we can ensure that the curricular, the faculty qualification, the clinical training meet the necessary accreditation standards. Secondly, the continuous training is key as well. Now, the faculty should receive professional development to keep up with the latest compliance requirements. That will ensure, of course, that all educators are aware of the evolving standards. And last but not least, having a strong internal controls is also something vital. And this, of course, involves setting up checks to make sure that assessment method, teaching practices, and other processes remain in alignment with the regulatory and accreditation guidance. An example of that, of course, is the health profession education program could face a compliance risk if it fails to update its curricula. For instance, by not including the new telemedicine competencies that has become increasingly important in the medical accreditation standards. So this is one of the examples of minimizing the compliance risk. So far we talked about the definitions related to the risk management. We talked about the concept of likelihood versus the impact. We talked about the four type of risk and its implication on organization, and we gave some examples on that regard. Now, the second section is about the approaches to risk management. That is start by the first part about the principles and aims of risk management. So the first principle is the proportionate. The proportionate means that risk management activities should be appropriate for the level of the risk the level of the risk in an organization. And for example, the higher risk operations require more extensive controls, while lower risk areas should be overburdened with excessive management procedures. We have the what we call the alignment principle, where the risk management shouldn't exist in isolation. It must be integrated with the other organizational activities to ensure a cohesive approach to decision making. That's lead me to shed the light to a very important term that is being used in several contexts, which we call informed decision, or risk-based informed decision. Now, also the comprehensiveness is very important because having a comprehensive approach for risk management and identifying those risks and managing them properly will help us to avoid gaps in our risk strategy. That's why in another bubble, if you look to our colleague in the specialty of public health, even the WHO now is adopting what we call the all hazards approach for emergency management context. And from public health perspective, they're adopting the One Health approach. So the comprehensiveness or the comprehensive approach of risk management is something that being evidence-based and called for by different institution or organization. Also, there is the embedded principles or the embeddedness, which is reminded that we shouldn't be separate tasks, but woven into the daily operation of the organization, meaning that the risk management shouldn't be something that we look for it seasonally. It should be part of our daily operation, and that's why there is a term we call the risk culture that needs to be considered as part of the strategic plans of different institutions. This definitely will ensure that the risk awareness and mitigation are part of the organization culture, as I mentioned. And there is a dynamic principle or approach which highlights the need for flexibility. Risk management is not an all or none approach. It must adapt to changing risk and circumstances, and whether there are new regulation or new aspects or guidelines or requirements needs to be adopted. So we need to have some sort of a flexibility in that regard. Now, the importance of the risk management is that it assures the stakeholders, whether the student, the faculty, or even the regulatory body, that risks are being carefully managed in our institution. So that's one of the important dimensions of the risk management. Secondly, it helps to have a better decision making, because by systematically analyze the potential risk and the uncertainties, we can make more informed decision, as I mentioned, and this help us to avoid the reactive decisions and instead take proactive steps to mitigate risk before they escalate. Also, the regulatory compliance is another important aspect where the risk management helps to ensure that we meet all the legal and regulatory requirements, whether it's complying with accreditation standards or adhering to healthcare regulation. And finally, the increased efficiency is one important area because the robust risk management system streamlines operations, and that happens by reducing the disruption and volatility. And of course, over time, this will lead to more stable and predictable outcomes, which contributes to the long-term sustainability of the organization. So risk management activity has several risk management has several activities that include the risk identification, which means how we can recognize and identify those risks that affects our organization. And the risk assessment is the second activity, which means the evaluation of the likelihood and the impact, likelihood versus impact for each risk. And there is a risk response, which means the implementation of strategies to mitigate or even transfer, accept, or avoid those risks. And finally, monitoring and review. So remember that the risk management activities includes risk identification, risk assessment, risk response, and again, monitoring and review. Those four activities are very important. It's very important to shed the light on each one of these and relate that to the context of health profession education and know exactly what is our role as a healthcare professional education expert when it comes to the enterprise risk management. Okay, effectiveness versus efficiency of the core processes, right? Now, the strategic processes where we develop and deliver strategies that align with our risk management objectives. At this level, leadership sets the direction, ensuring that risk management is part of the broader strategic plan process. That's why I mentioned in the previous slide that we need to look into a holistic approach for when it comes to the risk management, and that applies to have a cascading approach for risk management sometimes, or vice versa, and we'll have an example for that. Okay, and we have also what we call the tactical processes, which are more focused on managing specific projects or even operations, implementing the strategies they have developed. This is where the plans are translated into actions, and teams work to manage risk as part of their day-to-day responsibilities. Now, at the operational processes level, we ensure that the continuity and the effectiveness of daily operation. Here, the risk management is not a separate function, right? But a part of everyday workflow. And we have, by that, we need to make sure that the risks are addressed as operation or carry out on daily basis. And one of the excellent tactics to make those happen is to adopt what we call a risk culture strategy in your organization. Finally, we have the compliance processes, which ensuring the organization adheres to all legal and regulatory requirements. And as you know, the effective compliance helps to mitigate risk related to non-compliance and ensure that the organization remains or maintains the standard that's set by the regulatory body, regardless what it is. So, how can we implement risk management in our organization? So, first, we need to clearly define the planning and the scope. So, that's involve setting boundaries of risk management activities and ensuring that they are closely aligned with the organization's overall goals. Because without having these alignment activities, risk management can become fragmented and lose its strategic focus. And this is one of a huge gaps in implementing the risk management in our organization is that looking into the strategic management, looking into the strategic management in solo or individually based on the unit or the department without having a comprehensive approach. And we have the integration. This is also a key because risk management shouldn't exist in isolation. Instead, it should be embedded in every level of the organization core processes. And this is to ensure that every department, every team, and even every activity is aligned towards mitigating risk as part of their routine work. And lastly, we have the continuous improvement. Because risk management here is not something static. It requires regular feedback loops and assessment and updates to ensure that the strategies are in place, remain effective, and follow any type of environmental changes that might occur. So how we can achieve benefits of risk management? We knew the activities. Now, we know how we can implement them. So to achieve risk benefit, we need firstly to enhance resilience. And I would like to draw your attention to this term. This is a very trending, important term these days, and it's evolving very quickly. So enhancing resilience in risk management increases the organization ability to adapt, and without having even a huge negative impact on them. And this is crucial in dynamic industries such as the healthcare and the health profession education, because the external factors can change rapidly. Uh, we also have what we call the cost efficiency, where identifying and mitigating risk early, organizations can avoid unplanned costs such as the financial losses for disruption, fines related to non-compliance, etc., etc., etc. Right? The regulatory benefits of the implementing the risk management are another significant advantage because staying compliant with regulations not only prevent the legal issues, but can also position the organization as a leader in its field. Now, giving the competitive edge even in the market of health professional education, this particular regulatory benefit is very essential. Lastly, we have the operational stability, which is operational stability will be improved by implementing the risk management because a well-managed risk approach reduces the disruption in day-to-day operations, and by that you will be ensuring that the organization can maintain its services consistently, and even in the challenge of different type of situation that might occur. So basically, as you can see, the benefit is not only protect the organization, but also it provides a strategic advantage in terms of the cost and the compliance stability as well. That takes us to the second part in section 2, which is the risk management standards. So let's talk about the key standards in risk management that the organization often use to guide their practices here. First, we have the ISO 31000, which is an internationally recognized standard. It focuses on the systematic and structured approach to risk management that can be applied across industries. Uh, this standard helps organizations actually to understand risk, assess the risk, develop strategies to manage those risks effectively. Now, the second one is what we call the KUSU ERM. The KUSU ERM, which stands for Committee of Sponsoring Organizations Enterprise Risk Management Framework. This is one of the most widespreading framework, and it's used for managing both risk and internal controls within the organization, making it a comprehensive approach, a suitable comprehensive approach for entities to adopt it for governance and operations of enterprise risk management. And there's what we call the IRM standard, which is a standard that particularly useful for non-specialists in risk management because it provides a high level approach. It's very general approach, which make it accessible and practical for organizations that may not have extensive expertise in the area, but still need to manage risk effectively. So it's a good starting point for entities that don't have capabilities or capacities to approach enterprise risk management, but that doesn't mean that entities should start by this standard without looking or trying other standards. Now let's dive into the ISO 31000 risk management process. It provides a structured approach, as I mentioned, that can be applied across industries and identify and managing risk effectively. All right. So what does the process include? It includes establish the context, which is the first step to define the context in which risk arise. That means identifying your objectives and understanding the environment in which these objectives will be achieved. So by establishing this context, then the organization will ensure that management, the enterprise risk management align with your organization goal. The second process here is the risk identification. And this step, you basically recognize what could potentially go wrong. And this involves identifying the source of risk, events, situation that could affect your objectives. And here, you should consider both of them, whether they're negative or positive objectives. Yes. So the risk assessment is the third process I would like to talk about here, which involves analyzing and evaluating the identified risk, and we assess each risk based on two critical factors. I talked about them in the previous slide: the likelihood of occurring and the potential impact of these risks. And there is a process of risk treatment, which starts once the risk has been assessed. It's time to decide on actions to mitigate, control them. And definitely that's might involve reducing the likelihood or working on the risk happening, minimizing its impact, or transferring the risk, for example, through insurance, or even avoiding everything altogether, which is the best case scenario, of course. And we have the process of risk treatment. So once the risk has been assessed, there is the monitoring and review, which is basically should be an ongoing process because it's crucial to continuously monitor the risk and review the effectiveness of the control that you have put in place. And that's why the mitigation strategies also needs to be reviewed every time and then and make sure that they're effective on mitigating the types of risk that you identified. So these are the processes of ISO 31000. Okay, so to manage the risk, you need to have, we need to talk about the context. In the ISO 31000 framework, understanding the context is fundamental to implement those processes. So there are three main aspects to consider, which the first one we call the internal context, which refers to the factors within the organization that influence risk, and it includes organization culture, the structure, and the internal and other internal processes. For example, let's say how the decisions are made in the organization, the internal hierarchy itself, or the existing policies and procedures that might either mitigate or exacerbate the risk. That's why we had on Saturday session the policies and procedures and their development. And definitely they have a huge implication in some of the risks that perhaps you'll identify as part of your process in the enterprise risk management. The external context considers the broader environment which the organization operates. So factors like regulatory requirements, economic conditions, social trends, and technological changes all play a role in shaping the risk in organization in general. Well, it's important to understand it and to understand how these can force the likelihood and the impact of different risks. And we have the risk management context, which is overarching framework that connects both internal and external context. And it provides a comprehensive approach to identify, assess, and manage risk through the insurance of the organization consideration to all type of factors and contexts. Okay, so this is the CUSO ERMQ. I would like to draw your attention to this very important slide. So this framework is a comprehensive model designed to align risk management with organization strategy goals. Now, the Q format of the framework emphasizes its multi-directional and iterative nature, representing different perspectives such as the strategic operation, reporting, and compliance on one axis, which shows also the organization objective where risk must be managed. We have also the entity level, the division, the business unit, and the subsidiary on the other axis that reflects the risk management must occur every level of the organization. The final axis represents the core component of the CUSO framework. And here we would like to shed the light on these components. The first component here is the internal environment. The component of internal environment establishes the foundation of risk management. And that happened by setting the tone of the organization approach to risk because it encompasses the culture, the philosophy, the ethical values of the organization to guide how risk perceived and handled. And we have the objective setting that before risk can be identified, it's essential to define clear objectives. And this is a step to ensure that the risk management activities align with the organization's broader goal. That's why in the exercise also in Saturday, we had group two work on cascading some of the strategic objectives to give you the sense of how this usually happen and what are the the counterpart that is linked to this particular process. And we have the risk assessment, which risks are identified and evaluated based on their likelihood and the potential impact. And then we have the risk response, and we have the control activities and monitoring at the end. And there's also certain points I would like to discuss in the following slides, and I go, inshallah, عليها one by one. Okay, so there are features of risk management standards. So we focus on two key risk management standards that are widely across industries. احنا اتكلمنا هنتكلم على الايزو 31000، نتكلم على ال BS 31100. So standards focused on providing the structural framework that supports a systematic risk management process. ISO 31000 is an international standard, whereas the BS 31100 is the British standard. This is the BS. What the BS here stands for, the British Standard 31100. But both emphasize a constant approach to identifying, assessing, and managing risk. And we have, as we saw in the previous slide, the CUSO ERM, which is the CUSO Enterprise Risk Management Framework. It integrates, of course, the risk management with internal controls and create comprehensive risk management system. And it helps also the organization to manage risk while also ensuring that their internal controls are robust and effective. Now, let's go over some of the key features common on both these standards. We have the systematic process of both standards. Both standards emphasize on the structural approach of managing risk to ensure that there is a consistency in identifying or assessing and addressing risk across the organization. Also, we have the alignment with the strategic objectives, which is one of the key elements that the framework that risk management must align with the organization's strategic goal. And this ensures that the risk-related activities contribute to the broader success of the organization. And lastly, the third key feature here I can shed the light on is the integration with internal controls. So the integration of risk management with internal controls is another area we can look for, because it ensures that the measures implemented to manage risk are effectively embedded within the organization's process and decision-making framework. Okay, so we addressed in the previous slide that it's not a constant thing. There is a main principle about the emergency enterprise risk management is the flexibility and the dynamic principle of it. In that sense, we need to talk about the update of the existing standard. And here we need to look at how existing standards such as ISO 31000 and the British Standard 31100 are continually updated to reflect modern risk management practices and challenges. So the regular review for this is started periodically happens to keep pace with emerging risk technologies and change in industries. And this ensures that the organization follow these standards, remain competitive and relevant to the context of its scope of practice. One of the significant changes in the recent updates is the emphasis on the integrating risk management deeper into an organizational culture and its core processes. And this, of course, helps to foster a proactive risk management mindset across all levels of the organization, not only the strategic, or the operational, or the tactical level of the organization. And there is the alignment that uh, 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 those standards are aligned with all the global regulations. You know, it's not a standalone system, and uh, and, uh, and ensures that organizations adhering to these standards comply with international norms, which makes their risk management processes robust and adaptable and rapidly evolving with the evolving environment. And that's one of the most important aspects I would like to address here. Now, the third part is establishing this context. How does that happen? So here I will discuss the various contexts that ISO 31000 outline for establishing an effective risk management framework. Now, the context of risk management is critical to lay the ground work for any risk management initiative. And this framework is built upon three distinctive contexts as identified in ISO 31000: the risk management context, the internal context, and the external context. And I talked about this in the previous slide. Okay, so designing a risk register. So the risk register is a very important tool for tracking and managing risk, and it ensures that all identified risks are properly recorded and can be effectively managed. So it's very important to have a very well designed risk register. And saying that, it's very important that we give you some of the best practices of what the risk register should or can include. And again, this is the main principle. There are huge tools for risk registry in the market. You can adopt any one of them, or you can customize something at your local context. And that's why I would like to shed the light here on the are the most important elements to be included on the risk registry. The first one is the risk index, which is a unique identifier assigned to each risk. It helps to easily reference and track specific risks throughout the management processes. The risk description, as well, is a detailed description of the risk to include what could potentially go wrong and any factor that might contribute to the occurrence of the risk. And of course, the likelihood and magnitude that we talked about in the previous slide, which involve assessing the probability of the risk and the potential impact, meaning how likely is the risk to occur, or how severe would the consequence be. Controls in place, current measures that are being used to manage or mitigate the risk. And remember, as I mentioned earlier, it's not about only identifying the risk, it's about how we can control or mitigate those risks. And additional actions, which defines further a step that needs to be taken to reduce the likelihood or the impact of the risk. And of course, that might include implementing a new control, adjusting a process, or preventing a measure. Now, how effectively use a risk register and risk management? Here, a dynamic risk register is crucial because, as I mentioned, it ensures that the risk management process stays active and responsive to all changes. The risk register itself is not just a static document, but rather it should goes under an ongoing action plan for improvement and managing risk. So as a new risk emerge or existing risk evolve, the register must be updated to reflect current priorities. The risk register provides several key functions. So it serves as a record of current risk, including the controls, place, and any action needed to mitigate them. It offers also clarity by assigning responsibilities for managing and mitigating each identified risk. And it acts as a tool for internal audit and risk monitoring. And finally, the risk register must be regularly updated uh, 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 and reviewed to remain relevant, considering any evolving situation on the organization itself. That takes me to the fourth part, which is the enterprise risk management. The enterprise risk management, which is a wide approach, a wide approach. The ERM is a comprehensive approach of managing the risk across the entire organization. We know the risk management in general. Now, the enterprise risk in general, unlike the traditional risk management, often they handle risk in isolation. The enterprise risk management adopts a holistic approach, as I mentioned, to ensure that all types of risk are addressed in an integrated manner. And this approach, of course, emphasizes that the interrelationship between risk. For instance, a financial risk might impact the operation, might impact the operational risk, or a compliance issue could influence a strategic decision making. So by managing those interconnected way, we will manage to have a holistic approach for managing risks that might burden our institutions. So let's give some relevant definitions related to the enterprise risk management. I will start by the Risk and Insurance Management Society that describes the enterprise risk management as a strategic business discipline that addresses the entire spectrum of the organizational risk and their interrelated impacts. And there is the committee of sponsoring organizations of the Tradeway Commission defines the ERM as the process of identifying potential events that might affect the entity or managing the risk, managing risk within the organization, risk appetite, and also providing assurance in achieving its objective. This framework for the CUSUS focus in the balance, striking a balance between the management and risk management and achieving the organization objective, which is very important from continuity perspective. And this is a very important area in the enterprise risk management that needs to be addressed in a way and embedded in our context of health professional education. And we have the Treasury that emphasizes that the HM Treasury that emphasizes that the ERM is a comprehensive framework for identifying, assessing, mitigating, and monitoring risk for that could affect the organization's strategic objectives. So those are the previous one are the definitions for enterprise risk management. Now I would like to talk about the enterprise risk management and its application or organization, focusing on some important key points. They are terms of those responsible of the risk managers. We call them the chief risk officers, the CROs. Now, in sector with substantial risks such as the financial or energy organization, often the CROs بيكونوا عادة في البورد ليفل. وبيكون هو senior position. It's a senior position, and they have um, and they are linked to the head of the organization. And they will be responsible and overseeing the ERM process and ensuring that all risks are properly managed and mitigated. And we have the comprehensive emergency enterprise risk management. And and it shouldn't be considered as individual risk, but it needs to be applied holistically, as I mentioned. And we have what we call the PACE principle, which means that the effective implementation of the enterprise risk management relied on adhering to this principle, which is proportionate, aligned, comprehensive, embedded, and dynamic. And we discussed and mentioned those points in the previous slide. The PACE principle, the PACE principles. And there is, of course, a relation between enterprise risk management and business continuity. And of course, what's happening now in Sudan is a good example of how we can link those concepts all together. So here I want to show you the connection between the enterprise risk management and the business continuity planning, or the BCBs, because both of these frameworks are critical to ensure that the organization is prepared to manage risk and continue essential functions even during disruption. The enterprise risk management and business continuity relationship, it's something that we can look at it as very close together, because they both focus on maintaining core business processes. The enterprise risk management takes into a proactive approach, if you would, to identify the risk that could potentially disrupt the operations, while the business continuity planning ensures that there are plans in place to keep these processes running even after disruption has occurred. So you can see now the relation between two. So if I can give an example here, identifying the risk, the hazard risk that might affect the institution that you're teaching in needs, you need to have a business continuity plan to carry out activities if something happened from those identified risks previously, and if the mitigation strategies fail. So this is a very important link we need to understand. The ERM's rules in identifying the risk helps the organization to identify potential risks that could impact the critical operations. Now, these risks could include anything from natural disasters, cybersecurity threats, market volatilities, and the list goes on and on and on. Now, once these risks are identified, they need to be assessed in terms of likelihood and potential impact, and that will allow the organization to develop the appropriate response to deal with those issues if happen, God forbid. Now, the business continuity planning role in managing disruption, on the other hand, it focuses on the plan and on the plans and the processes necessary to maintain or restore the critical operations when the disruption has already taken place. So while the ERM is about risk prevention and mitigation, the BCB is about ensuring resilience and recovery, or going back to the normal as fast as possible. It answered the question of what happened if things goes wrong, as simple as that. And we have the alignment of the ERM and business continuity planning, which is something essential. And actually, if you go and read more about the business continuity planning or education continuity planning, you will find that some of the critical step of the BCB is to include a risk assessment, or to implement a risk assessment activity as part of the BCB activity itself. So in a nutshell, this alignment ensure that the organization not only manage risk effectively, but also recover quickly or being resilient or going back to normal to maintain business when disruption occur. That's enough. Now, the fifth part in the second section is the alternative approaches for risk assessment. Risk assessment or risk management has different approaches. Here, I will explain the concept of the emergent risk, which are risks that have recently become recognized or existing risks that have evolved لسبب أو لآخر. لكن most probably الأسباب زي ما اتكلمنا can be internal or external environmental factors. So emergent risk definition, emergent risk definition, it can be defined as newly recognized or previously known risks that have transformed due to changes, whether they be economic, technological, environmental, or regulatory. أو باختصار internal or external environmental factors. طبعا those risks require huge attention because they can have a significant impact on the organizational strategies and operations, and often in ways that are difficult to predict, even with entities that have a huge or a solid enterprise risk management system. Now, these emerging risk has types. The first type we call it can be new risk in known context. New risk in known context, and this refers to entirely new type of risk arising in areas that we are already familiar with. For example, the rise of a new cyber threat in established industries, right? And we have the known risk in new context. So the first one is new risk in known context, and the second one is known risk in new context. So the difference here, the new one here is the context itself. So these risks that we are aware of, but they manifest differently in new environments or industries. For example, data privacy concerns have existed for a very long time, but their scope and implications have increased with the widespread adoption of cloud computing, right? And we have new risk in new context. New risk in new context. So these are entirely new risks emerging in a new environment. And the example of would be the risk associated with rapidly evolving technologies such as artificial intelligence or the nanotechnology that we haven't encountered before. So basically, that's the types of emergency risk. Again, new risk in a known context, known risk in a new context, new risk in a new context, which is brand new. Now, examples of emerging risk, climate change, for instance. This is a global challenge affecting numerous industries, introducing risks related to sustainability, resource scarcity, external weather conditions, and the list goes, right? And there is also the sovereign debt, which is increasing global debt levels that can pose risks to financial stability as well. And we have the technological advancement, which is an absolute emerging risk, because new technologies such as the nano technology present risks that were previously unknown. So while these advances provide a significant benefit, also it can have an implication on other dimensions in risk. So this is I think a good example, and again, the artificial intelligence is one of these examples as well. The resilience. It's becoming increasingly recognized as a key factor in risk management. It's no longer just about avoiding or mitigating risk, but about the organization's ability to adapt and recover from an unexpected disruption. Actually, here in Saudi Arabia, it's becoming a theme, and it's been advocated by all type of leaders within the country and in different organizations. Now, whether due to technological changes, economical fluctuations, environmental shocks, resilience will help the organization to ensure they remain operational and can bounce back quickly after their crisis. The ISO double 2301 definition for definition for the uh, uh, the resilience is that it focuses on business continuity management, which defines the resilience as the capacity to adapt in complex and changing environment. طبعا the definition that emphasizes the resilience is not only a static approach, and the need for organizations to continually evolve and prepare to manage new and unforeseen risks. Business continuity and resilience also has a relationship. The standards such as ISO 22001 have become central to how organizations manage resilience. Now, the standards provide guidelines for preparing for potential disruptions, ensuring that organizations can continue to operate core functions even during crisis. Okay. Now, I've mentioned in the beginning of the section that there are different approaches to risk management. So um, uh, there are several approaches that can be considered for risk management. The diversified risk management framework is one thing to consider, which is basically uh, evolve actually to reflect different organization cultures, industries, and regulatory environment. وبطبيعة الحال الفريم دي زي ما قلت انه it's not a static thing, it's dynamic, it's updates as we go and as we evolve. في الكوكو framework in Canada, which is the criteria of control framework developed in Canada, focused on the concept of risk culture within an organization. طبعا according to the framework the effective risk management only happens when the organization culture supports it. معناتها واحدة من aspects of success capabilities هنا انه يكون في عندنا organization risk culture on hand. So this framework emphasizes that the health risk culture is key to any effective risk management strategy. And we have also the KUSU ERM framework that takes different approach, emphasizing the need for a strong internal control and internal control environment. Also, it integrates the risk management across level, as I mentioned in the previous slide. Well, strengths حقته إنه structured approach, the systematic approach of this framework, which not only helps to identify the risk, but also them are going to provide a systematic way of how we manage it. Okay, so في عندنا structure for the management standards in the ISO itself, and it's been added as an annex called the SL annex, which was introduced by ISO to provide the standardized framework for the management system standards across various disciplines such as quality management, environmental management, and risk management as well. The purpose of this annex is to create a unified structure to ensure that the management system standard across different sectors can align more easily. It has common clauses, and let's go through them and have few words on them by one. So the scope defines the range and boundaries of the management system, indicating that the standard, indicating what the standard will cover. The leadership, which focuses on the role of leadership in promoting and maintaining the management system, emphasizing on the management responsibilities. And the planning component, which involve the planning for the risk opportunities and achieving objectives as part of the system implementation. And we have the operations, which close the deals with the processes of operation that the organization needs to put in place to meet the standards requirement. And we have the performance evaluation, which ensures the organization monitors and measure its performance, making sure the management system functioning as expected. And last but not least, the improvement component, which highlights the need for continual improvement, focusing on the corrective actions and then how the system evolved over time to meet the emergency challenge. Now, the unified structure importance is that having the ISO 9001, the quality management, and the ISO 31000, the risk management, can share a similar foundation, right? Now, and this definitely ensures the consistency and compatibility across management system to make it easier for organization to manage the compliance with multiple standards within the unnecessary without unnecessary complexity that may occur. Okay, so the last part or the last slide in section 2 is about the future of risk management. As the landscape of risk management is quickly evolving as the new technology and the challenges emerge, the future focus will shift towards utilizing the digital tools and enhancing the organization resilience to deal with both known or unknown risks. The digital transformation is one of the key trends that shape this future for risk management, the advanced technology as well, because all these tools will support the real-time monitoring, the risk reduction, and even the automation of the risk management processes. And we have a very good example of this here in Saudi Arabia, and assume that's practice is something available in different entities and organizations in Sudan as well. The resilience and adaptation is a very important driver for evolution and shaping the future as global risks like climate change, the geopolitical instability continue to escalate. The importance of resilience and adaptation and risk management will definitely increase. And again, Sudan's situation is a very good example for that. And then, of course, the future strategies will definitely focus on building systems and processes that are robust through enough to withstand sudden disruption while adapting to long-term shifts in the risk environment. So the resilience isn't just about recovering from disruption, as I mentioned, but it's also about learning from them to strengthen the future responses. And we have the integration of the GRC function, which is the governance risk and compliance. And again, it's a trending functions in the context of risk management, and it's emerging trend. And it's start to grow, and there's several programs going on that. No, طيب. So it's very important to consider adopting and integrating approaches, organization that frameworks like the GRC function that will help to streamline the risk management and process on the same hand. So this is basically some of the future aspects that will delineate the shape of enterprise risk management in the near future by covering some of the trending topics in hand. And we have here now the component of risk assessment, how we can assess the risk and what consideration that we have that we can help us. And this is basically the application part of the enterprise risk management. And we need to understand first the importance of risk assessment. Now, risk assessment is very critical part of the overall risk management processes. It definitely helps the organization to identify, to prioritize, to evaluate the potential risk that might affect the organization. And without risk assessment, it's almost impossible to effectively manage the risk, because it serves as the foundation of understanding the risks exist and how significantly they are. Now, the conclusions that will be drawn from the risk assessment activities are essential for making information decision. All right. Now, these assessments allow organizations to identify the likelihood and the impact of the potential risk. They also enable the organization to prioritize risk, ensuring that the most significant threats are addressed first. So, working based on priority for risk management. Now, according to the British Standard 31100, the risk assessment includes three main activities: identifying risk, analyzing risk, evaluating risk. Identifying risk means to recognize what could go wrong. Analyze risk means to determine the likelihood and the potential impact of each risk. Evaluating risk means ranking the risk based on their severity and deciding which ones require the most attention. Now, the structured approach ensures that throughout understanding of the risk, it provides a clear framework for managing them. Now, we need to link this to the response, right? Because the output of the risk assessment is crucial to identify the appropriate risk responses, whether a candidate organization chooses to mitigate or transfer or even accept the risk or avoiding the risk all in all. So approaches to risk management. Let's see exactly how can we do this. So there are different ways for risk management depending on the level of the organization, involving the types of risk being addressed, and each approach طبعا serve distinct purpose in the risk management process. There is what we call the top-down approach, and here we take upon. Here, the senior management leads the risk management effort. Now, this method emphasizes the strategic and the external risks, such as changes in the market, economic downturns, and regulatory changes. The senior leadership team set the priorities, identify the high-level risk, and makes decision about how to manage these risks. The second approach is we take it from bottom up, and it's led by the operational staff, which focus on the local and internal risk. Here, The employees at different level of the organization assess the risk based on their day-to-day experiences. And the approach here capture more tactical and operational risks rather than strategic risks, such as the equipment failure, the processes inefficiencies, etc. Now, the combination approach, which is the more comprehensive approach, which is the blend of both top-down and bottom-to-up method, and it offers most comprehensive approach, as I mentioned, to integrate the strategic, operational, and tactical risk management efforts at the same organization in general. Okay, there are several techniques. So the risk assessment techniques are essential tools that helps to identify, evaluate, manage risk within the organization. And I will cover in this slide, inshallah, some of the most common used techniques in risk assessment, each with in the ايه الاشياء اللي تعتبر مصدر قوه لهذه الاداه وايش limitations that is related to this tool. Now we have what we call the checklist and questionnaires, and these are simple and structured approaches. The advantage of these, they are less time consuming actually and can be used by teams with varying level of expertise. You don't need senior team working or work in enterprise risk management. The limitation is that they might overlook risks that are not listed in the standard checklist, which makes them less effective for comprehensive assessment. So it's quick, it's easy, but you might overlook some of the important risks. The second technique is the brainstorming session. This is one of the most widely used, but it has, again, its limitation as well. So typically used risk workshops, multiple stakeholders come together and start to brainstorm and discuss potential risks related to the organization. Definitely, it encouraged the open communication and the diversity of opinions. However, senior personnel might dominate the discussion, potentially sidelining the important insight from the team members. So that's one of the issue of the brainstorming session for risk assessment as a technique. Having senior versus operational and tactical staff, the domination of the strategic representation of the members participating in the brainstorming session might have a sidelining of the rest of the team. And we have the SWOT analysis, which we discussed, we talked about it, which has the advantage of the SWOT analysis that it's widely used, actually, and for strategic planning, and it helps also to analyze both the internal factors, which represented through the strengths and weaknesses, and the external factors that's represented in the SWOT analysis through the opportunities and threats. The application of the SWOT analysis in organization, I think, is a great opportunity because, because understand it will help you to understand the internal capabilities and align with that can align with external risks. Okay. And we have the PESTLE analysis. The PESTLE here stands for political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental factors. The advantage of the PESTLE method is particularly useful for assessing risk related to the external environment that might affect an organization. It's commonly used actually by organizations to ensure that they are aligned with external regulation, market trends, social changes, and etc. The lower pictures here in the slide is how those techniques looks like. Now, the nature of risk matrix, which is important to understand, uh, and we need to understand first what is it exactly. The risk matrix is a visual tool that helps to evaluate, prioritize risk based on their likelihood and the impact. So it's commonly and it's a common and effective way actually for assessing risk to help organizations to determine which risk needs immediate action. Now, the matrix uses a grid structure where the likelihood event plotted on one axis والimpact بيكون في other axis. Okay. Then the risk categorized based on the placement in the matrix to low, which will be represented in green, which low priority risk, medium yellow or yellow, which indicates that risk should be monitored or addressed, but are less urgent. And we have the high demonstrated in red that highlight the critical risks that require immediate attention. So the priority starts from 3 اللي هو high risk and going to the medium and low. Now, I define the inherent versus the residual risk. I explained on the previous slide. However, just to remind you that the matrix can be used to assess two types of risk, the inherent risk and the residual risk. Again, the inherent risk is basically risk before any control or mitigation measures are put in place. With a residual risk, the risk that remains after controls and mitigation measures have been applied. عشان كده by visualizing all these through a matrix نحن ده بيساعدنا جدا to manage the risk in a proper way. Okay. So again, look again into this risk. It's very useful, and the rows here represent the likelihood of a risk occur اللي هو ranging from very likely to very unlikely زي ما انتم شايفين. وكمان الكولونز represents اللي هو impact of the risk اللي هو from negligible to severe. والcolor code اللي هو الgreen والyellow and orange red helps to visualize the level of risk. What exactly the color that draw your attention, and the red is where you need to start working exactly. Now, that's take us to a very important aspect, what we call the risk perception. Risk perception. Personally, I'm very interested in this area of risk management, and there's huge studies being and it's still going on since 50 years, just related to the concept of risk perception. This concept is being studied by our colleagues in the psychology, disaster mental health, and social studies experts and etc. So let's understand why is that and what does the risk perception means. So the risk perception refers to how individuals view or assess risk. And this perception can vary widely depending on the several in several factors. And I'm going to explain some of these factors in a moment. So what might seem risky to one person could seem completely normal to another person. And let's explore why this happened. And this is basically the area of research that I told you about. To answer that, there are factors that influence risk perception. The first factor is the voluntary versus involuntary risk. So if someone chooses to take risk voluntary, like driving a car or skydiving, uh, they may perceive this less risky in comparison to involuntary risk like natural disaster or sudden medical emergency, right? So voluntary risk tend to feel more controlled, while involuntary risk seems more dangerous because they feel unpredictable. All right. Okay. Now, natural versus human-made risk is another area we need to talk about. So people often perceive natural risk like storms or earthquake differently than risks caused by humans like industrial accidents or car crashes, right? And human-made risk can sometimes seems scarier because they may involve negligence or system failure. And that's a fact, right? احنا احيانا بنشوف ناس بيكونوا او احد مثلا يكون بيته جنب مفاعل نووي مثلا. So people perceive this risk differently. However, he can have the choice to live يعني في مكان آخر without other factor that affecting his or she's decision related to our accommodation near a nuclear plant, right? Now, the impact on voluntary group, especially the children, elderly individual, pregnant women, ممكن يشكل تحدي بالذات في موضوع البرسبشن. This is because بيكون في more vulnerable population when we didn't manage the risk perception in a proper way. We need to take this and apply it to health professional education context as well. So if you look to the image, أنا دايما بعرض الصور دي و sometimes I play some videos. So this is a great example of voluntary risk. So the lion tamer has chosen to put himself in a dangerous situation with a lion, but because he's trained for it, he may not perceive the risk as intensely as the outsider would, right? يعني زول مدرب على الموضوع ده هو الآن حط راسه في فم الأسد. أنا كمتفرج الموضوع ده مشكلة كبيرة يعني بالنسبة لي. لكن he's trained on that, right? So as you can see, we both individuals, we both agreed that's a risk, but he perceived this risk differently and deal or respond to this risk differently. And that is the concept of risk perception. في الرايت image we see here the reaction of people in a car, possibly about اللي هي شخص سايق سيارة بسرعة عالية جدا وهو as you can look into his face he's just normal, but his wife is screaming while he's driving his car in very high speed, right? So that gives you actually, if her wife called, she wouldn't drive the car in a very speedy manner, and because she perceives this risk in a different way than her husband. Now, what are the reasons behind that? This needs to be understood and analyzed as part of our risk management technique. Now, when it comes to what we call the attitude of risk, the organization's approach to risk can significantly shape the risk management strategies. And the attitudes here can generally be categorized into three main types: risk averse, risk seeking, or risk neutral. Now, risk averse is that where the organization with a risk-aware attitude tend to avoid high risks. ودينا primarily focus على موضوع safety, security, and stability. وعادة they prefer to minimize the potential losses and to avoid risky ventures. وحتى even they might their choice on that area might mean they miss يعني higher rewards, right? So let's have an example of that. A good example will be a risk averse strategy might be seen in industries like healthcare or utilities where safety is paramount, right? Now, risk seeking on the opposite end here organizations that are willing to take on high risk in pursuit of potential reward. هناك دول ممكن to avoid those risks هو to averse them حتى ولو كان على حساب awards أو rewardings. لكن ال risk seekers من الاورجنايزيشن ديل بيركزوا على الجانب الخاص بال أو rewards وهنا هم tend to innovate more, try new things, but they're not afraid of the uncertainty of risk itself. Startups of ventures capital firms, for instance, often adopt this mindset, knowing that the high risk can sometimes lead to high returns. Okay, and there is a balanced approach, which is the risk-neutral organization that strikes the balance between taking risk and playing it safe. They evaluate the risk and opportunities carefully and make decisions based on the potential outcomes, weighing both the pros and cons for each risk. The second part here is the risk analysis and evaluation. We talked about the risk assessment. Now we need to talk about the risk assessment and evaluation, starting by the risk assessment, starting by some considerations and definitions of the concept of risk analysis and evaluation. So basically, risk assessment and evaluation is the systematic process where we aim to understand the nature of the identified risk and determine its level, as simple as that. And the goal of that is primary to inform decision making, as we mentioned. And we achieve this by evaluating potential hazards, understanding their likelihood, and assessing the potential impact. In simple terms, it helps us to know what could go wrong, how often it could go wrong, and how bad the outcome would be. So this is exactly, in simple terms, what's going on in the risk analysis and evaluation. Now it has key components. The key components include the application of risk metrics that we talked about, assessing of inherent versus current level of current risk level, and again the confidence in control measure. Perhaps I would like to emphasize here in this point because an important part of the analysis and the evaluation of the risk is gauging how confident we are in the measures that we have put in place to mitigate risk. Are they control working? Can we trust them to minimize or eliminate the risk? And again, the risk matrix, again, we explained it earlier, which is the visual tool that helps us to rank and evaluate risk based on their likelihood and the impact, which is probability versus severity. And the yellow, the green, yellow, red, and perhaps we need to look at this and practice it more. And again, there is a lot of available templates that can be used for practice that are available in the market. Control confidence is an important term as well, which refers to the level of the trust assurance that the existing risk controls will effectively mitigate the identified risk. It's essential to assess how reliable and effective these controls are in practice to manage risk properly. Now, there is assessment factors for that confidence, which is the reliability of controls, which involve the evaluating how dependable the control mechanism are. Do they work as independent consistently? Also, the consistency, sorry, in the application itself is another assessment factor, which are controls being applied in the uniform manner across different scenarios, depending on the department itself or the function, right? And the maintenance and updating of control, just like the technology needs, updates happens to the controls itself, and they must be regularly maintained and adjusted to stay effective, especially when new risk emerge or environmental environments change. So what confidence level do we have? The confidence in controls can typically be classified into three categories. We have the high confidence, which means that we strongly believe in the controls ability to mitigate the risk effectively. We have the medium confidence, which means that controls are generally effective, but may have some occasional shortcomings. Low confidence level of the control, that means that we have a limited trust in the control's reliable or application. Why is that significance? Higher control confidence equates to reducing residual risk, which I defined it earlier. And if the control are strong and reliable, the risk is minimized more effectively. All right. So think about uh, think think here about the control confidence. If I can give a simple example, like the trust you have in your morning coffee machine, right? If you have a coffee machine, so the confidence control here is the trust that you have in your coffee machine. Is that kind of reliable and consistently makes you perfect brew مزاج عالي من الصباح, then it's high confidence. لكن إذا كان كانت الحكاية on and off, and sometimes you have a bad coffee, هنا معناتها there is a chance that your coffee machine might miss, اللي هو might result in you missing a good day before you go to work. So دي الفكرة اللي ممكن نبسط بها مفهوم الكنترول confidence in general. Now, how do we respond to risk? We have what we call the 4T's of hazard risk response. وتذكروا ان احنا بنتكلم هنا عن الهازard risk, okay? So the 4T's of hazard risk response provide a framework for addressing risk in an organization, and depending on the nature of the risk and the organization's capability or capacity, one of these four strategies can be or will be chosen. What are they? Tolerate, treat, transfer, terminate. Tolerate, treat, transfer, terminate. So tolerate, sometimes the risks are acceptable, right? So if they fall with the organization's risk appetite, هنا we can tolerate them. والrisk appetite معناتها how much risk I can accept. Okay? For example, if the potential impact of a risk is minimal or unlikely to occur, an organization may decide to tolerate it and accept the consequences, right? It's essentially saying we can live with this risk. يعني ما في مشكلة. عادي. Okay? Now, the second T here is treat. Now, in this approach, the organization seeks to mitigate or reduce the risk by implementing controls. So, for instance, a business might install security system, all right, to reduce the likelihood of thefts. Okay, so this is often the most active approach to deal with risk, where actions actually are taken to manage or lessen its impact. So هنا نحن بنكون more reactive toward يعني more actionable towards the risk, if you will. And we have the third T in the transfer, where the organization can share or transfer the risk by outsourcing it through contract or insurance. وكمان example here is to include اللي هو buying insurance policies to cover damage of damage over outsourced risk heavy functions to specialized firms. وهنا think of it like passing the hot potato to someone. فاهمني؟ يعني who better prepared to handle it. يعني so basically let's say you have a kid عمره سنة and you just prepare to him a very nice potato meal which is hot. You cannot rely on him to deal with it. So you transfer this risk to his dad, assuming that the dads are responsible of providing the food to the kids, or vice versa. The dad pass it to the mother, and then the mother will work in control aspects to lower the heat of the potato, and then give back the potato to the kid. So this is how we transfer risk. And we have also terminate. Terminates here uh, terminate here involve completely eliminating the risk. يعني avoiding the risk all at all. So for instance, let's say an institution identified a very risky project that might decide ممكن يقولوا خلاص نوقف المشروع ده before can cause harm to you anyone. ودي بنشوف ان احنا عاده في كثير من الاندستريز والبرودكتس سحب منتجات الى اخره. strategic decision making اللي هو اللي هو dependent on the significance of the risk of the organization ability to manage. So for significant high impact risk, the organization might choose to terminate to terminate or transfer them, while smaller manageable risk can be tolerable or treated. So basically هنا الابروتش دي بيختار بحسب اللي هو التايب اوف ريسك. وهنا الفكره كلها is اللي هو a dynamic approach of deciding the response approach that we need to consider dealing with this risk. Now, so there's also other terms that I would like to emphasize here, which we call the risk significance, which refers to how important and of a particular risk in the terms of its potential to impact the organization, right? This is we call the significance of the risk itself. And the significance of the risk needs to be assessed as part of the risk analysis and evaluation processes. One way to determine whether the risk requires further attention by conducting benchmarking tests. So these tests help to assess if the risk is severe enough to require additional controls or even mitigation strategies. أو يعني يعني deciding whether a small leak مثلا يعني او ايشو معينه مثلا في الطلاب او كده تحتاج انه نعمل more control or mitigation strategies dealing with them. Okay. Now, the other term is the risk capacity. The risk capacity is the ability of the organization to bear or handle the risk without jeopardizing its stability or operation. So the significance is whether the organization needs to put it as a priority to manage it, and the capacity is uh, 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 of the ability that the organization has to deal with this risk. So think of this uh, as how much risk an organization can absorb before it reaches to a breakdown point. عشان كده في مصطلحات سمعناها خلال كوفيد 19 اللي هو health system breakdown. The health system breakdown. آه، مين من البلدان او المدن او المستشفيات ما وصل to the level of breakdown. النقطة دي will be determined through a hospital risk capacity. كم بالضبط انا اقدر امتص من من الخطر قبل ما انا يحصل لي complete breakdown. If you think about it in a medical context, it's a sin which can be explained through the psychosocial diseases, right? How much the body can absorb shocks before it's it's being presented through symptoms like being high blood sugar or high blood pressure. So this is basically the same concept. So there are key factors to influence risk capacity. That include resources that the organization have enough money, time, manpower to handle the potential problems. Financial stability is another factors. If an organization is financially healthy, it can likely withstand higher risk, right? Operational resilience, the term and the title that is trending nowadays. How well can the organization continue functioning despite the risk? How much can the EDC continue despite the ongoing war? How much the student can continue despite the ongoing war? So all these being reflected by the EDC capacity and the student capacity or resilience to deal with this risk. Now, the objectives here is to align significance and capacity as part of your risk management process. So the ultimate goal here is to align them. Now, this means to ensure that the organization is prepared to handle significant risk based on its capacity, which will help to ensure long-term sustainability. فهمنا المعادلة هنا? So striking the balance between the capacity and the significance of risk equals sustainability and resilience. As simple as that from mathematical point of view. Now, sorry for being long, but the last section here is the risk response. So نحن تكلمنا عن الريسك management definition and concepts. اتكلمنا على موضوع الريسك assessment and its techniques. واتكلمنا في السكشن الثالث على موضوع الريسك analysis and evaluation. واخيرا حنتكلم على الريسك ريسبونس. نحن بنستجيب للريسك ريسبونس للريسك ازاي وشفناها في بعض السلايدز السابقه. So let's start by a risk control, some of the risk control techniques. So risk control techniques هم عبارة عن strategies aimed to reducing the likelihood and the impact of risk that might face the organization. Those techniques helps to manage the risk to ensure they do not affect the operation, the finance, or even the strategic goals of the institution itself. Now, we have several types of risk controls. Let's break them down. We have what we call the preventive control, which are proactive measures designed to stop risk from occurring. An example of that would be installing fire alarm and encrypting softwares to prevent data breaches في الكلية. Field corrective controls, which are reactive measures, meaning they are applied after risk has occurred to correct or minimize the damage. And we have the directive control. Directive controls are rules and policies, right? We talked about the policies and procedures that set in place to guide action or behaviors that prevent the risk itself. For example, an institution policy that requires two-step authentication, for example, for secure access, sending SMS to your mobile number before uh, one-time password, if you would, to access your modem, for instance. So that's one example of that. So we have also the detective controls, which are measures that help to detect when something has gone wrong. Example includes security cameras, audit logs, or track suspicious activities at real time. So those are the control techniques for risk. Uh, Now, this slide explains how risks are categorized based on the likelihood and the impact, leading to different risk zone that helps organizations to decide how to manage those rules actually. So let's dive into this for zones ونعرفهم مع بعض. The first zone, we call it the comfort zone, which the risk in this zone have low likelihood and low impact. An organization can choose to tolerate risk because it's within the acceptable levels, right? And no immediate actions is necessary. Example of that, the routine IT maintenance downtimes might fall in this zone, the green zone. The cautious zone, here the likelihood and the impact is medium, which requires more attention than the previous one, right? Now the focus here is on treating, right? The risk needs to be treated here by reducing its potential through controls. Example of this moderate risk is the data breach that could be managed by introducing more robust cybersecurity measures, right? And we have the concern zone, which is the orange one. Here, the impact, the likelihood and the impact will be high, make it more serious, and the risk needs to be transferred to another party, usually through insurance controls. ودي مثال لها الجانب المالي في الأمر. And we have the critical zone. In this zone, the risk have high likelihood and severe impact, right? And the only way here to manage this risk is to terminate the activity generating them to avoid catastrophic outcome. This is very important. If you have something, then you at the red zone, then you think about termination, right? Now, example of that of shutting down the hazardous operation to avoid severity incident زي اللي كنا نحن مثلا in the health in the hospital for instance having let's say an outbreak in the OR. That means we need to close the OR for a risk of secondary transmission, and the secondary transmission rate is one of the key performance indicators related to health care quality, right? فالفكرة بهذه الطريقة. Now, we need to understand those zones and where the risk falls into that help us to determine the most appropriate control measure. And the organization use these zones to prioritize their response strategies اللي نحن اتكلمنا عنه. فدي ببساطة الفكرة من الأمر. The preventive controls, quickly going through the preventive controls, the primary objective منها to prevent, to avoid the occurrence of the risk altogether. Now, it's done by either eliminating the hazard or minimizing its potential impact. وفكر في this as stopping a problem before even it starts. عشان كده حتى عندنا في الصحة we have the preventive medicine الطب الوقائي. نسمع في وزارة الصحة إنه الإدارة العامة للطب الوقائي. So they are targeting through control measures particular public health risks before they happen. The advantage طبعا of the preventive prevention is better than cure. So يعني reducing or eliminating the source of risk, that means that you might not need to implement additional risk treatment later. In a way, it's more efficient than other type of intervention. All right. So يعني prevention again is better than cure. Now going to the corrective and detective controls. The corrective controls are used after risk has been occurred. The goal here is not to prevent the risk from happening, but to mitigate its effect once the risk has already materialized. Okay, an example of that اللي هو the use of protective uh, personal protective equipment for during an epidemic. All right, the directive controls here guide people on what they should do to prevent to manage risk. Okay, so these controls come in the form of instructions or training to provide to, 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 to be provided before hand and to help to manage situation where risk arise. عشان كده احنا بنسميه دي واحده من الاكزامبلز ليها اللي هي بنسميه risk communication risk communication استراتيجي، ويمكن سمعناها في قنوات التلفزيون لما بدا كوفيد 19. You need to wear a mask, you need to have a social distancing, you need to wash your hands. كده ده بنسميه directive control. And then we have the detective controls, which are used after risk has occurred, and their role is to identify the risk and provide insights into what happened, helping to minimize future damage. Now, unlike the preventive controls, detective controls don't stop the risk from happening, but helps to understand how it occurred and how to manage the aftermath after it happened. So, for instance, an example of that is conducting financial audit. The audit helps to uncover fraud or حتى discrepancies في الميزانية تبع المؤسسة. فهنا انت بتعمل post incident فهنا انت الاجراء نفسه to detect الاشكاليات دي قبل ما to evolve the risk into a bigger financial implication. فدي واحده من الاسبكت. عشان كده الديتكتيف controls very critical حقيقه for monitoring the control effectiveness over time. يعني هو نفسه بيساعدنا to know exactly how effective is our control. So basically we learned today تكلمنا على موضوع risk management. We defined risk management. We talked about the risk assessment and its techniques. We talked about risk analysis and evaluation, and we talked about the risk response and the types of controls that we can implement. So that's all I want to address in this particular time. I know the topic is big, and I tried as much as possible to squeeze it to the max to fit the calendar of the quality and accreditation curriculum, and I hope it added some of the values that can be taken or adopted to your setup or facility that been working on. And yes, I'll be available in the next session if there's any question that I can answer related to this topic or otherwise. Thank you very much. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك. أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.